We have Mike Posner. I guess he's an advisor to the Carter Center and a human rights activist as well. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Posner. We really appreciate that. And if you can give us a little bit more context and explain what this moment means to you and those of us here in Georgia.
Well, thank you for having me on. I've been working in the human rights field for a very long time with a non-governmental group called Human Rights First, and then I was in the Obama administration running the Human Rights Bureau in the State Department. But really, I think of Jimmy Carter as being the person really on this earth who raised the profile of human rights, both as running for president, as president. He made these issues put them front and center. And then I got to meet him. I had the pleasure, the honor of meeting him right after he stepped down as president and set up the Carter Center. He invited a handful of us to come meet with him to sort of talk about what's the future hold, how does the Carter Center include human rights? And I was really privileged to work with him and people at the Carter Center over really decades to see how much he as an individual, as a leader, made a difference in people's lives. For him, human rights really was about the human. And it was about identifying leaders in other countries who were under pressure, sometimes jailed, sometimes being persecuted, and using his influence, his authority, and his connections to throw a lifeline to those people and give them some hope.
Before Jimmy Carter, there were no U.S. administrations who ever brought up the subject of human rights, and it certainly wasn't part of any of their diplomacy, or it wasn't part of how the State Department did business. After Jimmy Carter, we began to think about the meaning of human rights. When he would bring up human rights with Brezhnev, or it became an issue with the Chinese, it was something that we knew very little about in the United States, at least in a public way. But he changed that dynamic. He changed a narration, a conversation that included treating people well and without prisoners, without political torture.
Exactly. And it flowed from his concerns about inequality in our own society. It was very natural for him. And in fact, as an inauguration, he talked about making sure that there's freedom in the world. Within a few weeks of his becoming president, he wrote a letter to Andrei Sakharov, the famous Soviet scientist, Nobel Prize winner, dissident, expressing his support for the dissident movement in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And the Russians were furious with him for raising this issue. And people in the State Department, I would say as well, were very taken aback that all of a sudden the President of the United States was raising human rights issues. But it became, as you say, part of the architecture, part of the lifeblood of diplomacy. He made that happen. Without him, it wouldn't have happened. And the bureau that I ran, from 2009 to 13 existed because Jimmy Carter began that process and put a civil rights advocate, Pat Darien, in the place and said, this is going to be part of what what U.S. foreign policy is all about.
I noticed a Chicago accent, and I know you were a Chicago attorney. Did you have any cultural differences with President Carter as you came to Atlanta? This is a very different place than Chicago. Maybe not as much in 2025, but at the time that you were dealing with Jimmy Carter, Atlanta had a very Southern lilt about it that is sort of hard to find these days.
Yeah, well, I think there's even a cultural difference between Chicago and New York, where I've spent the last 4 decades. I feel like I'm from a little town. The pace was slower. It took me a while to get used to Southern hospitality, the friendliness, the warmth. He was such a decent human being. At the end of the day, everything was about human kindness. That was his brand. That's what he stood for. And he was so generous with his time, so willing to spend time debating, talking about issues. I guess that was part of the Southern way, but I grew to love it and really appreciate both what he stood for and how he lived his life.
President Carter, what he stood for was so different than any other president, especially when you consider the time period that we were in with just, not only human rights issues, but race issues as well. A lot of people, have been asking the question, what will become of the Carter Center now? As someone who has been an advisor to the Carter Center, what's one piece of this that you would like to see live on for sure, now that he and Rosalind are both gone?
Well, I think it's very important, as I say, from the get-go, he was determined that human rights was going to be an integral part of the Carter Center, both taking up individual cases, which he did all the time, the democracy, the election monitoring and the like, and his determination to sort of weave that in with what the Carter Center was doing on conflict resolution and the like. I think it's really important, maybe more important than ever, that the Carter Center maintain that commitment and that it maintains itself as part of the integration of all these issues. We're in a very tough time now where it's a fragmented world, it's a very polarized world. Our country, many other places around the world, are sort of stepping back on human rights. And for the Carter Center, which represents the president who put this issue on the map, I think it's more important than ever to reinforce the commitment and reinforce the important work that the Carter Center continues to do.
Mike Posner, who is a human rights activist and also advisor to the Carter Center, we really, truly appreciate you stopping by and giving us more context, sir.